"You're mine now," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, but the threat in her words was undeniable. "The sooner you accept that, the better it will be for you." Max's hands tightened into fists. He wasn't sure if she was trying to break him mentally, or if she was simply toying with him, but he wasn't about to give in. He had seen the way she looked at him, like he was something she could own, something she could control. He hated it. "I'm not your property," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. Valeris tilted her head slightly, her expression amused. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that Max couldn't quite place. Was it surprise? Maybe even admiration. But it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. "Oh, you will be," she replied, her voice cold and firm. "You'll learn your place soon enough. I will break you, just like the others before you." Max felt a flash of anger rise within him, but he forced it down. He knew that anger wouldn't help him right now. It was her strength, her control that made her dangerous. If he was going to survive this, he had to outthink her, not outfight her. Valeris circled him slowly, examining him from every angle, like a hunter studying its prey. "Humans are so predictable," she mused aloud. "Always fighting, always resisting, never understanding that resistance is futile. You think your spirit makes you strong, but in the end, you'll bend, you'll submit." Max clenched his jaw. She was right about one thing. Humans never gave up. No matter how many times they were knocked down, they kept getting back up. But he knew, deep down, that this was different. This wasn't just another enemy. She wasn't like anything he had faced before. As Valeris continued to circle him, Max tried to assess her, her movements, her gaze, her presence. She wasn't just physically imposing. She had a power about her, an aura that made everything else in the room feel insignificant. He knew he had to be careful. One wrong move, and he could end up dead, or worse. But he wasn't going to let her break him. He couldn't. Not after everything Earth had been through, not after everything humanity had endured. Max had seen destruction, pain, and loss. But he had also seen hope, strength, and the unyielding will of humans to survive. He wasn't going to let Valeris take that from him. "You don't scare me," Max said, his voice unwavering. Valeris stopped in front of him, their faces inches apart now. There was a strange intensity in her gaze, something that Max couldn't quite understand. For a moment, he almost felt like she was studying him, not just as a prisoner, but as something else. It was almost as if she were trying to figure out what made him tick. "You will," she said softly, a dangerous smile curling at the corners of her lips. With a sharp motion, she turned and walked to the door. She didn't look back. "You'll be tested," she called over her shoulder. "Your spirit, your mind, everything you are. And when you fail, I'll be here to collect what's left of you." Max stood there, his mind racing. He was beginning to realize something. She wasn't just a ruthless commander. There was something else, something deeper beneath that cold exterior. And if he could figure that out, maybe, just maybe, he could turn the tables. But for now, he had to survive. He had to hold on to his strength, because if he didn't, there was no telling what would happen next. The door slid shut, leaving Max in silence once again. But this time, the silence wasn't as oppressive. He had learned something. Valeris wasn't just his captor. She was a challenge, and Max had never been more determined to rise to one. Max's mind raced, but his training took over. He knew he had to wait for the right moment, the right weakness, the right crack in her armor. He couldn't fight her head on. Not yet. But he would. He had to. As Valeris turned to leave, she glanced back over her shoulder. "You will learn your place, human. The sooner you accept it, the easier it will be." The door hissed shut behind her, leaving Max in silence once again. His heart still raced, but now there was something else, something stronger than fear. A fire had been lit inside him. Max knew he wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for his freedom. and the chance to prove that no one, not even a Xanari, could break him. The battle had only just begun. Max had barely recovered from the shock of his capture when she entered the room. At first, he thought he was seeing things. The woman who walked in was tall, far taller than any human woman he had ever met, with an air of power and confidence that seemed to fill the room. Her skin was a deep, almost glowing shade of blue, like the ocean under a full moon. And her eyes, those eyes, were a burning gold, like molten metal, that seemed to pierce right through him. She moved with a grace that felt unnatural, almost alien. There was something both beautiful and terrifying about her. Every step she took seemed calculated, deliberate, as if she knew exactly how to control the space around her. To Max, she looked like a predator, and he, helpless in his current situation, felt like prey. The doors to his cell slid open with a hiss, and she walked in without a single glance at him, her gaze focused ahead. Her presence was enough to make the air feel thick and heavy. Max could feel the oppressive weight of her confidence, and it made his stomach twist. "I am Valeris," she said, her voice smooth and chilling, carrying an authority that left no room for argument. The words hung in the air, a silent warning. She was not someone to be taken lightly. Max tried not to show his fear. His training told him to stay calm, to never let his enemy see weakness. But inside, his heart was pounding. This was the Xanari commander, the leader of the aliens who had destroyed his ship and captured him. He had heard stories of them, stories of their ruthless strength and their advanced technology. And now, here she was, standing in front of him. Valeris took a moment to study him, her glowing eyes scanning him from head to toe. Max tried to stand tall, but the shackles on his wrists pulled him down. The Xanari woman didn't speak for a moment, but her expression was one of curious amusement. "I've seen your kind before," she continued, her voice laced with disdain. "Weak, fragile, always thinking you can fight back, always thinking you can win." Max didn't say anything at first. He wasn't sure what she wanted from him. He knew he was in a dangerous position, but he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him terrified. Valeris stepped closer to him, and Max could feel her presence growing stronger. Like a storm about to hit, she stopped just a few feet away, her golden eyes narrowing as she looked at him. Max had never imagined that his mission would end like this. One moment, he was piloting his shuttle through the vast emptiness of space, scouting a distant alien planet, and the next, his world was consumed by fire. The sudden strike of the Xanari fleet was like a thunderclap in the quiet of space. Before he could even react, the ship was rocked by a barrage of blasts, throwing him off balance. The warning alarms blared, flashing red lights in every corner of the cockpit. His systems malfunctioned, and the shuttle spiraled out of control. Max fought to regain control, but it was useless. The powerful alien ships were too advanced, and their weapons overwhelmed his defenses. With the ship tearing apart around him, he barely managed to eject in a small escape pod. As the pod shot away from the wreckage, Max looked back to see his once mighty vessel consumed by an explosion. The flames reached into space, spreading outward like a deadly flower. He was now a small, vulnerable speck in the vastness of the universe. His pulse raced, his heart pounding in his chest as he drifted away from the destruction. But there was no time to panic. He had to survive. He activated the distress beacon, hoping against hope that his crew would pick up the signal. But as the seconds ticked by, nothing happened. No answer. Max felt the cold embrace of space, but it wasn't the cold that worried him. It was what lay ahead. He'd heard stories of the Xanari, a race of technologically superior aliens known for their cruelty. He knew that his chances of survival were slim. Still, his military training kicked in, and he focused on getting his pod to a safe zone. But before he could make any headway, the calm of space was shattered by the sudden appearance of a Xanari ship. It was enormous, towering above his tiny pod, its dark metal surface gleaming ominously against the backdrop of stars. Max's hands tightened around the controls as the ship's tractor beam locked onto him, pulling him in like a moth to a flame. His attempts to break free were futile. The ship's technology was far beyond anything Earth had ever seen. Within minutes, the pod was swallowed by the alien ship, and Max found himself surrounded by cold, unfamiliar walls. He had been captured. His body was thrown into a high-tech holding cell with no windows and no way to escape. The ship's walls were lined with strange, pulsating lights, and the air felt thick, heavy with the scent of metal, and something else, something alien. Max's mind raced as he tried to figure out his next move. He wasn't just any soldier. He was a trained fighter, resourceful, quick-thinking. But none of that would matter if he didn't escape soon. The walls of the cell felt like they were closing in on him, and the realization of his helplessness began to sink in. He was alone, abandoned, trapped. Just then, a voice echoed through the ship's speakers, cold and mechanical. Subject acquired. You will be delivered to the mistress shortly. Remain compliant. Max clenched his fists in frustration. Mistress. What did that mean? His mind raced, trying to understand. The Xenari didn't care for prisoners. They were either slaves or experiments, nothing more. He could feel his stomach tighten as he realized he wasn't just a captive. He was something to be controlled, something to be owned. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. The door to his cell slid open with a soft hiss, and a tall, commanding figure stepped inside. She was a Xenari. Her skin was a deep shade of blue, and her eyes glowed like molten gold. Her beauty was otherworldly, but it was her cold demeanor that struck Max the hardest. I am Valeris, she said, her voice smooth and commanding. You are now mine. She took a slow step forward, eyes never leaving his. There was no emotion in her voice, only the cruel certainty of someone who had never been challenged in her life. To her, he was nothing more than a plaything, a pet to be tamed. Max's pulse quickened as he stood his ground, not showing any sign of fear. He would not give her the satisfaction. I'm not your pet, he replied, his voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside him. Valeris tilted her head slightly, studying him as if he were an interesting specimen. You will learn to obey, she said coldly. I will break you. Max's heart pounded in his chest, but he knew he couldn't give in. He couldn't let her control him. Every part of him screamed to escape, to fight back, but he knew that right now any attempt would be futile. The Xenari had technology that Earth couldn't even dream of, and he was alone, unarmed, and surrounded by enemies. I don't belong to anyone, Max said, his voice low and defiant. Valeris stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. You do now. All humans are weak, and I will prove it. As he sprinted down another hallway, the thought burned in his mind. He was not just a prisoner. He was a warrior, and he would never stop fighting. Max's pulse hammered in his ears as he sprinted through the corridors of the Xenari ship. The communicator he had taken from the guard was still clutched tightly in his hand, and he used it to listen for any signs of danger. His heart raced with each step, and his mind worked fast. He knew the escape had only just begun. He was still in enemy territory, and the Xenari would stop at nothing to recapture him. The alarms had already gone off, and it was only a matter of time before they started hunting him down. The ship was massive, its metal walls stretching endlessly in every direction. Each hallway seemed to lead to another maze of rooms, each more alien and unfamiliar than the last. He had no idea where he was or where to go, but he couldn't afford to waste time. His only goal now was to reach the control room and gain access to the ship's navigation systems. If he could take control of the ship, maybe, just maybe, he could turn the tide in humanity's favor. But to do that, he needed to find a way to disable the ship's defenses. Max stopped in front of another door, his breath shallow, his heart pounding. His mind raced, calculating his next move. He knew that the Xenari had a strong military presence on the ship, and he had already taken down one guard. But the deeper he went, the more dangerous it would get. If he was caught, there was no way out. He had to be careful. He glanced at the communicator again. The display was flickering, but it was still working. Max could hear the voices of the Exenari soldiers on the other side of the ship, moving in his direction. They were getting closer. He couldn't afford to be caught. He had to act fast. Max pushed open the door and slipped into the next room, praying it wasn't another trap. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he quickly scanned the room. It looked like some sort of control room, with multiple consoles and blinking lights. This was the place he had been looking for, the heart of the ship's operations. If he could hack into the system, he could disrupt the ship's defense systems and make his escape. Just as he approached the nearest console, the door behind him slammed open with a force that made him jump. He turned quickly, but it was too late. Standing in the doorway was Valeris, her glowing golden eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. She was flanked by two of her most elite guards, their weapons drawn and ready. Max's heart dropped into his stomach. He had been so close. But now he was trapped. Valeris stepped forward, her gaze never leaving him. Her lips curled into a cold smile, and for a moment, it almost felt like the walls of the room were closing in on him. "You should have known better than to think you could escape, human," she said, her voice smooth and mocking. Her eyes glinted with amusement, as if she had already won. "You are nothing compared to us." Max gritted his teeth. He wasn't going to let her intimidate him. He had come too far to back down now. "I'm not your prisoner anymore," Max said, his voice firm. "And I'm not afraid of you." Valeris tilted her head, studying him for a moment. Her expression was unreadable, but Max could feel the tension in the air. She was powerful, but he wasn't going to let her see his fear. The human spirit was strong. He had seen it in his fellow soldiers, in the eyes of every person who had ever fought for their freedom. Valeris might have all the power and technology in the galaxy, but she couldn't break that. "You think your defiance means something?" Valeris asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're just a weak human, clinging to false hope. You'll learn soon enough that resistance is futile." Without warning, one of the guards raised his weapon and aimed it at Max. The barrel of the gun gleamed in the dim light, and Max could feel his heart race. He knew he had to act quickly. But then, just as the guard was about to pull the trigger, Max made his move. With lightning speed, he dove to the side, knocking the guard off balance. The shot went wide, hitting the wall behind him. Max grabbed the guard's arm, twisting it in a quick motion that disarmed him. The gun fell to the floor with a loud clang. Valeris was momentarily stunned by the sudden move, but she quickly regained her composure. She nodded to her remaining guard, signaling him to attack. The second guard lunged at Max, but he was ready. Max sidestepped, grabbing the guard's arm and using his momentum to throw him into the control panel. Sparks flew as the guard collided with the consoles, knocking him out cold. For a moment, it was just Max and Valeris in the room. The sound of the two unconscious guards was the only noise in the tense silence. "You're more resourceful than I gave you credit for," Valeris said, her voice tinged with something that almost resembled respect. But there was no time for Max to savor the small victory. He could see her getting ready to attack. Her hand moved to her weapon, and Max knew that it wasn't over yet. Before she could react, Max moved again, grabbing the disarmed guard's weapon and aiming it at her. But Valeris didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "You think you can defeat me with that?" she taunted. "You are outmatched, human. Your kind can never beat us." Max's grip tightened on the weapon, but he didn't fire. He wasn't looking to kill her. He was looking for a way out. He needed to keep her off balance, keep her distracted long enough to finish what he had started. He needed the control panel. "Maybe not," Max said, his voice steady despite the fear he felt inside. "But I don't need to defeat you. I just need to survive." Max made a quick decision. He turned and ran towards the control panel, moving fast, knowing that he was out of time. The door behind him slid open, and Valeris shouted an order to her remaining guards. But Max had already pressed the button, and the room was filled with a loud beeping sound. The ship shook suddenly, and alarms blared around them. Max didn't wait to see what happened next. He had set the ship's internal defenses to go offline for a short period of time, buying him enough time to escape. He dashed through the door and into the dark hallways of the ship, the sound of his footsteps echoing in his ears. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't done fighting yet. This was far from over. Max's heart raced as he sprinted down the narrow corridors of the HFY ship. The alarms were blaring, and red lights flashed around him, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He had no idea where he was going. All he knew was that he couldn't stop. Valeris and her guards were surely on his tail, and if they caught him, it would be over. The ship's internal systems were temporarily offline, but that wouldn't last forever. The HFY were too advanced for him to hide for long. He rounded a corner, skidding to a halt as he almost collided with a large metal door. The communicator in his hand buzzed, and he quickly pressed it to his ear, hoping for any sign of escape. The voice on the other end was a familiar one. "Max," the voice said, urgent and calm. "This is Lieutenant Carter. We're tracking you. You've triggered a signal in the ship's navigation system. Stay low and don't stop moving. We'll get you out of there, but you have to hold on for just a little longer." Max's chest tightened with relief at the sound of his fellow soldier's voice. He wasn't alone. Carter and the rest of the rescue team were out there, waiting for him to find a way to get back to them. His heart filled with determination. He couldn't fail now. He had to survive, no matter what. He quickly shoved the communicator back into his pocket and pressed his back against the cold metal door, listening carefully. Every footstep, every distant sound, made him jump. He had no idea if the HFY were still behind him, or if they had already started their search elsewhere. But he couldn't let his guard down. Not now. For a moment, it was just Max and Valeris in the room. The sound of the two unconscious guards was the only noise in the tense silence. "You're more resourceful than I gave you credit for," Valeris said, her voice tinged with something that almost resembled respect. But there was no time for Max to savor the small victory. He could see her getting ready to attack. Her hand moved to her weapon, and Max knew that it wasn't over yet. Before she could react, Max moved again, grabbing the disarmed guard's weapon and aiming it at her. But Valeris didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "You think you can defeat me with that?" she taunted. "You are outmatched, human. Your kind can never beat us." Max's grip tightened on the weapon, but he didn't fire. He wasn't looking to kill her. He was looking for a way out. He needed to keep her off balance, keep her distracted long enough to finish what he had started. He needed the control panel. "Maybe not," Max said, his voice steady despite the fear he felt inside. "But I don't need to defeat you. I just need to survive." Max made a quick decision. He turned and ran towards the control panel, moving fast, knowing that he was out of time. The door behind him slid open, and Valeris shouted an order to her remaining guards. But Max had already pressed the button, and the room was filled with a loud beeping sound. The ship shook suddenly, and alarms blared around them. Max didn't wait to see what happened next. He had set the ship's internal defenses to go offline for a short period of time, buying him enough time to escape. He dashed through the door and into the dark hallways of the ship, the sound of his footsteps echoing in his ears. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't done fighting yet. This was far from over. Max's heart raced as he sprinted down the narrow corridors of the HFY ship. The alarms were blaring, and red lights flashed around him, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He had no idea where he was going. All he knew was that he couldn't stop. Valeris and her guards were surely on his tail, And if they caught him, it would be over. The ship's internal systems were temporarily offline, but that wouldn't last forever. The Xenari were too advanced for him to hide for long. He rounded a corner, skidding to a halt as he almost collided with a large metal door. The communicator in his hand buzzed, and he quickly pressed it to his ear, hoping for any sign of escape. The voice on the other end was a familiar one. "Max," the voice said, urgent and calm. "This is Lieutenant Carter. We're tracking you. You've triggered a signal in the ship's navigation system. Stay low and don't stop moving. We'll get you out of there, but you have to hold on for just a little longer." Max's chest tightened with relief at the sound of his fellow soldier's voice. He wasn't alone. Carter and the rest of the rescue team were out there, waiting for him to find a way to get back to them. His heart filled with determination. He couldn't fail now. He had to survive, no matter what. He quickly shoved the communicator back into his pocket and pressed his back against the cold metal door, listening carefully. Every footstep, every distant sound, made him jump. He had no idea if the Xenari were still behind him, or if they had already started their search elsewhere. But he couldn't let his guard down. Not now. Max turned to the door in front of him. It had a small control panel, just like the others he had seen on the ship. He approached it cautiously, running his fingers over the buttons. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew the ship's systems had to have some sort of control over its doors and escape routes. There had to be a way out, and he was determined to find it. As he worked the panel, a strange thought crossed his mind. The Xenari were far too advanced to let someone like him, just a human soldier, get this far. They had underestimated him, yes, but what if they had set him up? What if they had allowed him to think he was escaping, only to lead him into a trap? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Just then, the door in front of him clicked open, and Max stepped into the room. It was much smaller than the control rooms he had seen before, but it was filled with strange equipment, unlike anything he had ever encountered. In the center of the room stood a large spherical device, its surface glowing with an otherworldly light. Max's eyes widened as he took in the sight. He didn't know what it was, but it certainly didn't look like something the Xenari had built to help him escape. As he moved closer to inspect the device, the communicator buzzed again. He froze, a chill running down his spine. This time, the voice on the other end was different. It wasn't Carter. "Max," the voice said, smooth and cold. "You've done well to get this far, but it's time to stop running." Max's blood ran cold as he recognized the voice instantly. It was Valeris. His heart skipped a beat. How had she found him so quickly? He had disabled the ship's internal security systems for a brief moment. She shouldn't have been able to track him so fast. "Don't bother trying to escape," Valeris continued. "The ship is locked down now. We're in control, and you're running out of time." Max's mind raced. He had been walking into a trap this whole time. The system he had triggered earlier, the one that had temporarily disabled the ship's defenses, hadn't been a glitch. It had been part of her plan all along. The Xenari had let him think he was winning, but they had been monitoring him every step of the way. And now, they had him cornered. He spun around, desperately looking for another way out. The door he had entered from slammed shut behind him with a loud thud, and the walls of the room began to pulse with an eerie light. The device in the center of the room hummed, its glow intensifying. Max's mind raced. There had to be something he could do. He wasn't just going to stand here and let them capture him. His fingers tightened around the communicator, and he quickly pressed it to his ear again. "Carter, do you copy?" Max said urgently, his voice tight with panic. "I've been set up. The ship's locked down. I need a way out. Now." There was a long pause on the other end. Then, Carter's voice crackled through the communicator, his tone grim. "Max, listen to me carefully," Carter said. "We've been monitoring the ship's systems. You're not just on any ship. You're on their flagship. And that device you're standing in front of, it's not a simple control panel. It's a weapon. They're going to use it to wipe out the fleet. Max's blood ran cold. He had been so focused on escaping that he hadn't even considered the possibility that the Exenari had other plans. This wasn't just about him anymore. He was standing in the heart of their warship, and the weapon he had triggered was about to destroy everything. "Carter, how do I stop it?" Max demanded, panic rising in his chest. A deep sense of relief washed over Max, but it was short-lived. The ship's systems were still on high alert, and the threat was far from over. He had stopped the weapon, but the Exenari would not let this go. The battle wasn't won yet. Turning to Carter, Max gave a sharp nod. "The weapon's offline. We need to get out of here, now." But just as they turned to leave, the ground beneath them trembled, and a voice, Valeris's voice, echoed through the ship's speakers. "You think you've won." Her tone was cold, mocking. "The destruction of your fleet was never my true goal. You, Max, are the true prize. Do you really think I would let you walk away after all this?" Max's stomach dropped. He hadn't stopped just a weapon. He had unknowingly triggered a trap for himself, one last move in Valeris's twisted game. Before he could react, the doors slammed shut, trapping them inside. The lights dimmed again, and the walls seemed to close in. Max reached for his weapon, but the door opposite them slid open, revealing a small army of Exenari soldiers. They had been waiting, watching. Max's soldiers immediately took defensive positions, but the odds were against them. The Exenari were superior in every way. Better trained, better equipped, and they had numbers on their side. Max's heart pounded again, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was the cold realization that even with everything he had done, it might not be enough. "We can't fight them all," Carter said, his voice low. "We need to find a way out." Max glanced around, looking for an escape, a plan, anything. His mind raced, but then, through the chaos and the confusion, he saw something. A small, reinforced hatch on the far side of the room, half hidden behind a panel. The hatch wasn't large enough for all of them to escape at once, but it was their only chance. "Over there," Max shouted, pointing to the hatch. "We make a break for it. Now." Without waiting for a response, he rushed toward the hatch, followed closely by Carter and the others. Blaster fire cracked through the air, and the sounds of battle echoed behind them. But Max didn't look back. They had one shot at survival, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. Max reached the hatch first and slammed his hand against the control panel, opening it just as the Exenari soldiers closed in on them. He pushed Carter through the opening, and then the rest of his team. The hatch slammed shut behind him just as the blaster fire reached its peak. Max's breath came in short gasps as he realized they had made it. They were free. But the fight wasn't over. They weren't out of danger yet. Still, as Max led his team through the narrow escape tunnels, he felt a sense of hope. They had survived the worst of it. The Exenari might have underestimated humanity once, but they wouldn't make the same mistake again. Max had proved that, and he would continue proving it until the war was won. When they finally reached the escape pods, Max paused for just a moment, looking back at the ship they had fought so hard to bring down. It wasn't just about the Exenari. It was about what humanity stood for: resilience, bravery, and the unwillingness to back down, no matter the odds. As he stepped into the pod and the door closed behind him, Max looked at his team. Carter gave him a nod, a small, tired smile on his face. Max's heart swelled with pride. They had done it. The battle was over, and they had won. For now, that was enough.